April 16, 1953. Pork Chop Hill, Korea. Lieutenant Thomas Harrold pressed himself against the frozen earth of the trenches on Pork Chop Hill and listened to the sounds of the Chinese assault that had been going on since midnight and showed no signs of stopping. The hill designated by military maps as O.P. Harry but called Pork Chop by every soldier who had ever looked at it from below because of its distinctive elongated oval shape with a slight narrowing in the middle was 255 meters high, barely more than 800 feet above the surrounding terrain. It was not a strategic position. It did not command a river crossing or a road junction or any terrain feature that would influence the course of a war. It sat on the main line of resistance in central Korea, one of dozens of similar positions that the two sides had been contesting for 2 years in a war that had stopped moving and started grinding. The Korean War armistice negotiations had been going on since July 1951, 2 years of diplomatic argument over the location of the ceasefire line and the repatriation of prisoners of war, conducted at Panmunjom in a tent while soldiers on both sides continued to die for hills and ridgelines that everyone understood would be abandoned when the negotiations finally concluded. The war was not over. It was not advancing. It was burning at a constant temperature that consumed men without producing results. Harrold had 42 men when the Chinese assault hit at midnight. By the time dawn arrived, he had fewer than 20 still capable of fighting. The positions that should have been held by a full company were being held by the remnants of a platoon, in trenches that had been partially destroyed by the Chinese assault, against a force that Chinese commanders were feeding into the attack in waves that replaced the casualties of the previous wave with fresh soldiers. This was the Battle of Pork Chop Hill, a battle that lasted from April 16 to April 18, 1953, was fought over a piece of ground that the Army eventually abandoned in July 1953 anyway, cost approximately 243 American casualties in the April battle and 243 more in the July battle, and demonstrated with brutal clarity what the Korean War had become in its final months. To understand Pork Chop Hill, you have to understand what the Korean War was in the spring of 1953 and why men were fighting and dying for a hill that nobody actually needed. The war that had begun in June 1950 with the North Korean invasion had gone through its dramatic phases: the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter, the brilliant reversal at Incheon, the catastrophic intervention of the Chinese in November 1950, the grinding retreat and recovery of the winter of 1950 to 1951, and the stabilization of the front along the 38th parallel in the spring of 1951. Since then, the line had barely moved. The stabilization was not accidental. Both sides had concluded, at approximately the same time, that the costs of further offensive operations were not justified by the potential gains. The Chinese could push the UN forces south, but they could not sustain the casualties that the advance would cost against the firepower that American forces could bring against them. The Americans could push the Chinese north, but the cost in casualties to take and hold positions against an enemy that could replace its losses faster than American domestic politics could absorb the casualties would be prohibitive. The armistice negotiations that began in July 1951 were an acknowledgement of this mutual understanding. Both sides wanted to stop fighting. Both sides also wanted to stop fighting on terms that did not appear to be a defeat, which meant that the negotiations that should have taken weeks took 2 years while soldiers continued to die. The positions that the two sides held at the moment the armistice was eventually signed would become the ceasefire line, meaning that the Chinese had an incentive to attack UN positions and the UN had an incentive to hold positions not because of their military value but because of their negotiating value. Every hill and every ridge that changed hands was a negotiating chip, a piece of terrain that could be pointed to at Panmunjom as evidence that one side was winning or losing the war that was supposedly being ended. Pork Chop Hill was one of these negotiating chips. The Chinese assault that hit Pork Chop on the night of April 16th was not primarily designed to hold the hill. It was designed to inflict casualties on American forces and to demonstrate that Chinese forces could seize and hold a position defended by American troops, both to influence the armistice negotiations and to test American resolve in the final months of a war that the Chinese command understood was nearly over. The American response to the Chinese assault was itself a test of American resolve, not because the hill mattered strategically but because losing it would signal to the Chinese negotiators at Panmunjom that American forces could be pushed off their positions when the Chinese chose to push, which would influence the negotiations in ways that American military and political leadership wanted to prevent. Lieutenant Harrold's 42 men held through the night of April 16th because they had weapons and training and the specific quality that American soldiers demonstrate in the most difficult circumstances, the quality of holding on past the point where rational calculation would suggest that holding on is possible. By dawn on April 17th, Pork Chop Hill was partially in Chinese hands. The counterattack that the 7th Infantry Division launched to retake the positions that had been lost was itself a demonstration of the costs that the final months of the Korean War were imposing on American forces. The counterattack was successful. Pork Chop was retaken. The casualties sustained in taking it back were added to the casualties sustained in losing the first positions, and the total was charged against a hill that would be abandoned in July anyway. The men who fought the counterattack included soldiers from the 17th Infantry Regiment and the 32nd Infantry Regiment, men who had been in Korea long enough to understand exactly what kind of war they were fighting and who fought it anyway because that was what soldiers did when they were ordered forward. Corporal Charles Pendergast of the 17th Infantry described the counterattack in terms that captured the specific character of Korean War combat in 1953. "You went up the hill," he said. "The Chinese were in the trenches ahead of you. You cleared the trenches. Men died clearing the trenches. You got to the top and you held it, and the Chinese came back at night and you cleared the trenches again." That was Pork Chop. That was most of what Korea was by 1953. He was describing a war that had become a daily ritual of attrition without purpose, in the specific sense that the purpose, the negotiation of an armistice, was happening in a tent at Panmunjom while the killing happened on the hills. The April battle for Pork Chop Hill ended on April 18th with the hill in American hands and approximately 243 American casualties, including 56 killed. Chinese casualties were substantially higher, estimated at between 1,500 and 2,000 killed and wounded in 3 days of fighting on a hill that was 255 meters high. The July battle was larger and bloodier and ended differently. In July 1953, with the armistice negotiations in their final stages and the ceasefire line's location nearly agreed upon, the Chinese launched another assault on Pork Chop Hill that was substantially larger than the April attack. This assault was part of a Chinese offensive across multiple positions along the main line of resistance that was designed to maximize Chinese-held territory in the final days before the armistice was signed. The battle that followed was the most intense fighting of the Korean War's final phase. American units defending Pork Chop were reinforced repeatedly as the Chinese assault consumed regiment after regiment of defenders. The fighting in the trenches and bunkers of Pork Chop in July 1953 was of the kind that produces casualties at rates that peacetime military planning does not contemplate, men dying in trenches that were 30 meters apart, fighting with rifles and grenades and in some cases with bayonets and fists in positions where the distance between combatants was too small for any other weapon. The decision that the American command made during the July battle was the decision that defined what the war in its final phase had actually been. After several days of fighting that was consuming American casualties at rates that the military situation did not justify, the commanders at the highest level made the assessment that Pork Chop Hill was not worth what was being paid to hold it in the final days of a war that was already over in every sense except the formal signing of the armistice. General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 8th Army, ordered Pork Chop Hill evacuated on July 11, 1953. The men who had been fighting and dying for that hill for 3 days, who had watched their friends killed in the trenches and had held the positions they were ordered to hold, were ordered off it and it was given up. 3 weeks later, on July 27, 1953, the Korean War Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The ceasefire line was drawn where the two sides stood at the moment the armistice took effect. Pork Chop Hill, which the Americans had just evacuated, was assigned to the communist side. The men who had died for Pork Chop Hill had died for a piece of ground that was given up before the ceasefire. The negotiations that their deaths were supposed to influence had concluded without their sacrifice changing the outcome. This is the moral weight that the Battle of Pork Chop Hill carries, and it is a weight that is different from the moral weight of most battles because it is a weight that cannot be resolved by pointing to a strategic result. The men who died at Pork Chop died in a war that had stopped being about winning or losing and had become about negotiating, and their deaths were costs in a negotiation rather than contributions to a victory. The soldiers who fought at Pork Chop Hill understood something of this. The Korean War was the first American war in which the domestic political context of the conflict was sufficiently present in the awareness of the fighting men to shape their understanding of what they were doing and why. They were not under the illusions about the meaning of their sacrifice that soldiers in a war with a clear and achievable objective can sustain. They knew the war was nearly over. They knew the negotiations were at Panmunjom. They knew that the hills they were taking and losing and retaking had no military value in the strategic sense. They fought anyway. They held their positions when they were ordered to hold. They counterattacked when they were ordered to counterattack. They brought out their dead and their wounded because that was what American soldiers did. That is the specific thing about the Korean War that the Battle of Pork Chop Hill illustrates most clearly, The quality of American soldiers who continued to perform their duty with professional competence and personal courage in circumstances that stripped away every justification for those qualities except the most fundamental one. The man next to them needed them to keep fighting. So they kept fighting. Lieutenant Harrold, who had held Porkchop with 42 men in the darkness of April 16th, said in an interview decades later that he did not think about the strategic significance of the hill or the negotiations at Panmunjom or the political context of the Korean War while he was fighting. I thought about my men, he said. I thought about the ones who were still alive and what I needed to do to keep them alive. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. He was right. In the trenches of Porkchop Hill in 1953, the whole thing was keeping your men alive and holding your position. Everything else was somewhere else, in the tent at Panmunjom or in the newspapers back home or in the assessments of the commanders who were making decisions about what hills were worth holding. In the trenches, it was simpler than that. The men held because they were American soldiers and because holding was what American soldiers did. That was Porkchop Hill. That was the Korean War in its final months. That was what the men who fought there were and what they did and why they deserve to be remembered in the same way that the men of Normandy and Iwo Jima deserve to be remembered, because the courage they demonstrated was not diminished by the absence of a clear strategic purpose for what they were asked to do. They were asked to hold. They held. That was enough. In war, it is always enough, when men do what they are asked to do in circumstances that argue against doing it. They held Porkchop Hill. And then they were ordered to leave it. And they left it like soldiers, which meant in good order and carrying their dead and wounded. That was the Korean War. That was Porkchop Hill. They held. They fought. They came home. For a war that nobody remembers, the men who fought it were soldiers that anyone would be proud of.